Hi, I'm Miss Tyler. Welcome to Context for Kids, and we're starting our new project today. I'm so excited. Today we're going to start in the book of Matthew. So we are going to start in the most important stuff there is in the Bible, and that is studies into our Messiah, Yeshua, also known as Jesus. This teaching is going to be about genealogies, and it's going to be rated PG. So that is pretty much anyone can watch this teaching without problem. But make sure you get your parents' permission before watching this PG-13 teaching. Tell them we're going to be studying Messiah's genealogy. We'll be right back. Okay, so welcome to Context for Kids. This is Miss Tyler. And I've been sneezing all day. Hopefully I won't sneeze on you. Guys been sneezing all week. It's nice and warm outside. I live in Idaho Falls now. You know, we moved. And so I'm having to get reused to all the Idaho pollen. I lived in southern Idaho for 10 years back in the 90s and early 2000s. My children were born when we last lived here. And today is their 16th birthday. So Matthew and Andrew, I love you. Happy sweet 16. And thank you to their birth mother, Stephanie. You know, my children are adopted. And we're going to be, Matthew chapter 1 is the story of another adopted boy. Very much more famous than my children will ever be. But that's one of the things that's really, really interesting about our Messiah is that he was adopted by the man whose genealogy we're going to study today. And the fact that he was adopted is going to be very, very important later. Matter of fact, if he wasn't adopted, this genealogy wouldn't work out very well. But it's the answer to an age-old curse. So, in the ancient world, adoption was absolute. And we're going to be talking about that in a few weeks. And probably in about 6 weeks, we're going to be talking about it. All right, but let's talk about genealogy. Now, Matthew chapter 1 is Joseph's genealogy. And how do we know that? Well, because the genealogy in Luke 3 doesn't, she's descended from King David too, but she's not descended from King David through Solomon. And God swore that, and we'll talk about this when we get to Mary's. I'm just going to give you a little quickie information without any real proof, but I'm just going to tell you, and we're going to do that. We might even do it next week. Yeah, I think we'll do it next week, even though I was planning on teaching about something else, but I think it's right. So we're going to jump ahead to Luke. Anyway, so Mary's genealogy only goes through Nathan, David's son. But God promised the everlasting kingdom through Solomon. So we know that the kingship of Israel has to go through Solomon and Solomon's kingship line. So if someone isn't descended from King David through Solomon, well, they can't be Israel's king. They can't be the son of David. And of course, everyone called Yeshua that. Now, why did they call him that if he was adopted? Well, they didn't care. When Yeshua was born, Joseph named him. And we'll talk about that more in the ancient world. When a man took a child and named him, it was like that child was genetically his. There was no difference. I think that's a great way of doing it. My husband took my sons and named them. And they're our sons. They are absolutely our sons. We couldn't love them anymore if I'd given birth to them. So, anyway, let's look at genealogies. What's the big deal? What are the big deals? Because we've got these two genealogies for Messiah. There's a very good reason for them. Now, why did they keep genealogies? Well, genealogies are very important in the Bible. The Bible starts out with genealogies. It starts out with the descent from Adam through Noah, and then a little later, Noah through Abraham, and then it gets to Abraham through, you know, the 12 tribes of Israel, and everybody counts their genealogies. The priests had genealogies, everybody had these genealogies. The genealogies told you what tribe you were from. Now in the first century, when Jesus was born, Yeshua was born, they weren't really paying attention to tribes anymore because things had gotten kind of jumbled. 10 of the tribes had gone into exile hundreds of years before the 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin. But we still do see some people from Anna from Asher and, Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, so that was one of them. But we see people mostly being called Jews, okay? And in those days, Jews was actually a word that meant you were from the Roman province of Judea. Now Jesus, Yeshua, was a Galilean. Now he was still Jewish. He was still descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. But he lived in Galilee, so he was called a Galilean. Isn't that weird? See, today we call anyone who's Jewish a Jew. But that wasn't the way it was then. They had Jews from Judea, Galileans from Galilee, and Greeks from the dispersion. Isn't that funny that they called Jews Greeks? Because we would think, we would go Greeks and we'd go, oh, they're talking about the Gentiles. Not necessarily. I mean, yes and no. But, again, that's stuff we're going to be talking about in the future. So, they had to keep the genealogies. Well, one, they had to keep them for the kingship, because they knew that the kingship of David would rise again. They had to know who was related to the king line of David. And the priests, they had to have bloodlines traceable back to Aaron. All right? And actually, not to Aaron, but to a man named Zadok, okay, who was a descendant of Phinehas, because God kept narrowing down the priesthood just due to certain circumstances. And those are a little too complicated to go into. We're not going to. Just trust me on it. Hopefully trust me on it. And hopefully I'll be worthy of that trust. But everybody had to be from the line of Zadok to be serving in the temple at the time of Yeshua, because of different priestly families doing things wrong. But Zadok was promised an everlasting priesthood, his descendants. And then you have your regular Israelites, just the people who were not related to King David. Of course, in those days, probably a lot of people were related to King David over generations and generations, you know. But, you know, just regular people. So they wanted to know people's genealogy. And we're going to talk about why later, because I didn't understand this until I just read it in a book that a friend of mine gave me. And it goes through all of the Jewish writings, and so many answers to the things in the New Testament are in there. So, anyway, that's a book called, it's by a guy named Lightfoot. It was written in the 1850s. It was called Commentary on the Talmud and Hebraica in the New Testament. Whew. It's some book. And that guy was mean. He hated Jews. Dang, it was hard to read that book. But he'd never met a Jew in his life. He didn't understand why they did what they did. And a lot of people in those days, you know what? Protestants hated Catholics. Catholics hated Protestants. Protestants hated Jews. Catholics hated Jews. Jews hated Catholics and Protestants. Everybody just hated each other. It's not like that anymore. We're learning about each other. And that's a good thing. Because God... excuse me. God doesn't want us to go around hating people. So, now, where did they keep them? Well, actually, this is interesting, and this is something I found in this book. After the Babylonian exile, Ezra returned to the land with a bunch of people, and they made a diligent search into people's genealogies, and they put them into the public records. And they had different, I believe the name of the place was the Zistos. I believe it was a gymnasium / record office, and they kept genealogical records. They would keep people's family trees in the records. Now, they only kept the men's. You wouldn't keep the women's. You would, in the genealogy, you would you would note when a daughter was born, but the daughter wasn't, you didn't know Mary, daughter of Martha, daughter of Elizabeth, that kind of stuff. You wouldn't do that. You would only keep track of the male families. That's just the way it was in the ancient world. And it's only in modern times that when we look at genealogies, that you would look at your mother's genealogy too. So that's very modern. Oh, and some people get confused because nowadays the Jews have something called matrilineal descent. Now, matrilineal descent means they want to know who your mother was and your grandmother was, and I think your great-grandmother, to decide if you are something called halakhically Jewish. Now, if your mother, grandmother, and maybe not great-grandmother, were actually Jews, that means that at least your grandmother could have converted to Judaism. But unless you have that, then you're not considered someone who's Jewish, and you would have to convert to Judaism. Very complicated, and people get a little confused and think that the Jews in Yeshua's time, or in any time, counted descent through the woman. They didn't. They did. It just wasn't done. And through the Bible, it talks about, your sons after you, that sort of thing. Let's see. So they kept them in these public records. So when the writer of Matthew, which we assume is Matthew, and then the writer of Luke, which actually we know is Luke because it actually says, we know Matthew is supposedly Matthew by tradition. Okay, he didn't sign it at the end like Paul did with his later sign with big. Paul would always say, "See, look at my big handwriting." Look at some of Paul's letters. He actually, look how big my hand is. Evidently, his handwriting was not great, but he made up for it with other things, right? We all have our gifts, and calligraphy obviously wasn't one of Paul's gifts. So they would keep these in public records, and so the author of Matthew and the author of Luke, all they had to do was go down to the public office and say, "I want to see the family records of," and they were there, and you could prove it. But why did they keep them? Well, in Babylon, they had a problem. They were there for 70 years, and not everyone followed God's commandments, as far as not intermarrying with heathens. So some people were intermarrying with Gentiles, with idol worshippers. Okay? And in those days, the word Gentile was synonymous with idol worship, with idolatry, because all Gentiles worshipped idols. That's just what they did. Monotheism wasn't really practiced, where you have one God. And we've grown up in a world where it's hard for us to imagine people only worshiping one God. But if you grew up in India, you'd know that people can worship many gods. But in most places of the world today, people are monotheistic. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and certain other religions are monotheistic. They believe in one God and only one God. All right. But some of the Jews who went into exile in Babylon, like I said, they intermarried with idolaters, polytheists, people who worshipped more than one God. Zoroastrians, they had two gods. They thought one was good and one was bad. Then before that, the Babylonians worshipped many gods, and the Assyrians as well. And people had intermarried with them. Well, this was a problem for the Jews. And the Talmud tells us that when Ezra left Babylon, he took everyone of mixed blood with him. Well, what does that mean? That means that everyone who they weren't sure how Jewish they were taking to the land of Israel with Ezra the priest, so that Ezra the priest could bring them before the Sanhedrin court, that's the Supreme Court of Israel, and they could make rulings as to whether the person was a legitimate Jew or had to undergo a conversion process to become Jewish, and they didn't want mixed blood. I mean, it was a very racist time, okay? People in the ancient world were very racist. It's just the way it is. All right? Now, some of that was based on the laws. Okay? And in those days, they did blame the child for the sins of the parent. All right? But the Bible forbids mixed marriages, and so, they really didn't have a choice, that they had to do something. So they've got all these people with a pagan parent or grandparent, so they take them to the land. Are you beginning to see the problem for somebody who was born in the land of Israel and is claiming to be the Messiah? Now, the Messiah had to be pure-blooded Jewish. He was the son of King David. He couldn't be mixed with anything after King David. And he had to come from a Jewish wife of King Solomon, like Rehoboam did. It gets really complicated. So what if you claim to be Messiah and you were in the land, or people were claiming that you were the Messiah and you were in the land, but you couldn't prove that you weren't one of the people from Babylon who came back with pagan blood? Well, that would be a problem, except they kept these records. And so that's why we have Joseph's genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 and Mary's genealogy in Luke chapter 3. Those genealogies, because Mary's doesn't seem very exciting. He was, through David, through Nathan. Doesn't seem, it's like, well, what the point is that? What the point of that is that Mary's genealogy was full of Jewish names. Everybody in Mary's genealogy was Jewish, and they were marking down in those genealogical records if the mother was a pagan. And his genealogy doesn't have that. And even in the Talmud, they don't even argue about that. They don't say, well, yeah, but there were pagans. No, they had those records. Now, those records were destroyed. Almost all Jewish records were destroyed when the Romans destroyed the temple and some of the city, burned some of the city below in 70 AD at the destruction of the temple. And that's really too bad because the record houses were burned. But these were written before then. And so they weren't contestable. Because it's the records of the Jews. And they're not going to argue with them. Oh, interesting. Where's my proof that Luke's genealogy is Mary's genealogy? Well, here we go. We get it in the Talmud of all places. Now, the Talmud was Jewish writings. The earliest ones were codified like at 200 AD. Okay? And the rest were commentary, and they were compiled for a couple of hundred years. Well, they call Mary the daughter of Heli. If you go to Luke 3 and you look at Mary's genealogy, it says Jesus, son of Joseph, son of Heli. Now that's another interesting thing. And you know what? I think I'm not going to have another one next week. I'm just going to have it all be this week. So you've got, in Matthew's genealogy, you've got Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judah and his brothers, Judah begat, all the way down to, excuse me, I think it's Matthias who begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom came Jesus. That might not be the exact wording, but Mary's genealogy is different. Mary's genealogy says, Jesus, son of Joseph, because he was a legal son of Joseph, son of Heli, son of, all the way to son of Adam, son of God. Okay, that's different. Why didn't it say, and God begat Adam, and Adam begat Seth, and Seth begat Enosh, and Enoch, right? That's the way Joseph's genealogy was done. Well, this commentary I was reading was talking about how when things are worded like that, because we've got to look at other Jewish writings. Okay, it's important because they're the ones that did everything this way. So when you look at it, and when you look at it from Jewish point of view, what Mary's genealogy is really saying, Jesus, son of Joseph, Jesus, son of Heli, Jesus, son of, Jesus, son of, Jesus, son of, all the way to Jesus, son of Adam, Jesus, son of God. Because they were relating Jesus to everyone. They weren't saying that Joseph was the son of Heli and Heli was the son of, no. They were linking Jesus. Go and look at it. It's really cool. And I never saw that before. And it was really interesting. So, why did they do Mary's genealogy that way? Well, for a couple of reasons. But like I said, in the Talmud, they call Mary the daughter of Heli. So they recognize those writings as Jewish, and that way of doing a genealogy is Jewish. And with their experience, they saw clearly that Mary was the daughter of Heli. So Luke's genealogy is hers. And anyway, you got Jesus, son of Adam. Why is it important that Jesus is the son of Adam? Well, I'll tell you. In Genesis 3, there's a verse that says, and the seed of the woman shall, it talks about the seed of the woman shall crush the head of the serpent. Well, who was Adam's wife? Adam's wife was Eve. Eve was the woman in that prophecy. By saying Jesus is the son of Adam, they're saying Jesus is the one who crushed the head of the serpent. And then it says Jesus, son of God. Well, we know that Adam wasn't the literal son of God. God created him and he breathed life into him. But Jesus is different. Yeshua is different. He is the literal Son of God. We know from the Bible that the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary and she became pregnant with him. Jesus didn't have a human biological father. Mary was a virgin. She still had not yet been brought into Joseph's home. They were engaged, but they had not gone through the wedding supper yet. Mary was still a virgin. All right? Isn't this cool? All right. So, now, there are some people who like to make the Matthew genealogy to be Mary's. There's a problem with that because you can't inherit the kingship through a mother. You just can't do it. It's against the law. No one would have accepted it. And there's another problem. There was a king in that line who was cursed, the last one. And no seed of his would ever sit on the throne of David. Well, how do you get around that? How do you have somebody be from that line, but not be from the seed of that person? Very simple. It has to be an adoption. And like I said, adoption was absolute and final in those days, and no one would have questioned him being Joseph's legal firstborn heir. It's just the way it is. And it's like that now too. But when I was born, it wasn't. When I was born, people were often very ashamed of adoption. As a matter of fact, when I was a kid, there were people who had been adopted who didn't even know. Now it's a big celebration, and the whole family's involved with the adoption, and people wait, and people pray, while people are waiting on the adoption waiting list. It's not a shameful family secret, never should have been. It's a time of celebration and rejoicing and hope. See, I'm going to cry now, because my baby's turned 16 today, and I remember. Okay, we're not doing this. Okay, they're going to be embarrassed. All right, now, let's go to Matthew's genealogy. We're going to go back to it. And we've got the generations, and here's another thing where people are going to say, there's a problem with this. There's only a problem if you're not looking at it from the standpoint of Jewish literature and the rest of the Bible, because the rest of the Bible has these same problems that are only problems to our modern mind when we decide everyone has to do things our way. Isn't that kind of silly? When we say, well, if they don't write history the way we write it, it's not legitimate history. And if they don't do this the way we would do it. It's not legitimate. And if they word things differently, they came before we did. We changed things. We don't get to, like, say, you should have lived by our changes, you know, back before they were made. Nobody wants to. I mean, imagine, okay, if something you were, okay, imagine if reading the Bible became a crime. Okay, and then you're not allowed to read the Bible anymore. Of course, you still do. But then they said, well, let's not only arrest people we find reading the Bible, let's arrest everyone who's ever read the Bible. Well, that would be ridiculous. You can't retroactively apply a law and say, well, everyone who was guilty of it before it was a law is guilty now too. I mean, that's what we do when we say that everybody should have always done things the way we do now. That's just ridiculous. Okay, so we've got generations, and it says there are 14 generations between Abraham and King David, 14 generations between King David and the exile, and 14 generations between the exile and Yeshua. Okay? And so they say, but it's not. Okay, so what? But it's not a problem. So anyway, there are actually 14 generations between Abraham and David. Not a problem. But then they count David again, and they go to the last king, okay, that went into exile. So they count David twice. But this was perfectly acceptable in ancient genealogies. But the problem was they skipped 3 generations. Oh, and you get extra credit if you can go and figure out which kings are missing. But there are 3 kings missing, okay? And you can say, well, they were bad kings. No, one of them was a good king, so we can't use that. Okay, so actually there were, there were 17 kings. But then they go 14 from the exile to Yeshua. Now some people say that there are not 14 generations, but they say that they always forget to count Yeshua. Jesus at the end of it. So there really are. You have to count the last person in the line, because they counted the last person in the line on the other ones. Okay, so that one's not a problem. But why did they say that in the middle set that there were 14 when there were actually 17? Well, it's because they wanted to communicate something with numbers, which is something that Jewish writings do. 14 plus 14 plus 14 adds up to 42. And they knew that they were skipping generations, but they were trying to make almost like a code, all right? And that code was about the Exodus. There were 42, 14 times 3, places where they camped in the wilderness on their way out of Egypt. And the authors, and this is kind of, I don't want you to worry about it if you don't understand it. Just going to introduce you to the concept, because we're going to be talking about it more and more and more. You see, the early church fathers and the early New Testament writers, when they would talk about Jesus, they would talk about him in Passover terms, in Exodus terms. Exodus was the freedom of the Jews from the bondage of slavery. When Jesus died and resurrected as on Passover, he kicked in the second Exodus, the greater Exodus, the Exodus where all the world would be delivered from having to worship false gods. And the slate of all men was going to be wiped clean so that they could come to God and come into covenant with him and worship him through the blood of Yeshua, of Jesus. All right? So, yes, they skipped. But you know what? We're going to find that throughout the Bible, that they would skip generations and genealogies in order to do this. In all the Jewish writings, you see this in a lot of Jewish writings. If they want to arrive at a certain number, they'll just, do little things with the things to make it so they can communicate a concept. Now, we would say it's lying, but let's look at it this way. Okay, so your grandpa beget your father, right? Because your grandmother gave birth to your father, or they adopted him. and your father gave birth or adopted you. Or your father did not give birth. Somebody needs to go back and take biology classes again. It's right here. Okay. But it's also true to say that your grandfather beget you because you come from your grandfather, just like your father did. Okay? You've got the same genetics. Now, they didn't know genetics back then the way we do now. They didn't know the DNA. But you see what I mean? You could say, that's why you could say Jesus, the son of David, because it was true. He was descended from David. All right? He was descended from David legally through Joseph. He was also descended physically through Mary. Okay? Very cool. That's the way that Jews look at things. When they did the genealogy of Ezra, okay, the priest, they left out like 6 people. Nobody cared. They just, kept going and sent it back, and they didn't even acknowledge that they left a gap of 5 because it didn't matter to them. Because they knew it's true that a man's a man comes from his great-great-great-great-grandfather. Of course he does. Of course he does. Where else is he supposed to come from? It's just a chain. All right, so that's the missing links. And people counted twice. Okay, so I hope that made sense. So what do we have in the end? We have Joseph's genealogies, which makes him the son of David. Okay, and the son of David was king, just like the son of God means king. We're going to talk about that. Oh, and the son of God throughout the Bible, it was first used to describe Solomon, son of God. God told David that he would adopt Solomon. We actually learned this when we did New Testament Background Studies #1, David and Solomon. So go back and check that out if you want to find out the origin of the phrase son of God. Okay? And Mary's genealogy makes him the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head and undo the curse from the garden. Okay? Very cool. Very cool. All right. So, hope that makes sense. And here's my email address. If you have questions, feel free to ask. And if you have too many questions, I will do a follow-up video. I hope this makes sense. All right? It's kind of complicated, but it's important that you guys understand. Because there are people out there, and I'll tell you right now, they're called anti-missionaries. Okay? And some of them are Jewish, but a whole lot of them are not Jewish. They are people who used to believe that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah, but they denied him. And now they spend their time lying about him and tricking people into doubting and denying him. So a lot of things I'm teaching you so that you know their tricks. Okay? And one of their tricks is they'll tell you something's wrong with the New Testament, but they won't tell you that you can find the exact same problems with the Old Testament. And the problems aren't problems at all. They're just the way people wrote and thought about things back then. Doesn't make them wrong. After all, their way of thinking came before ours. We can't hold them to our standards of accuracy and precision. We just can't do that. So there is nothing wrong with either of these genealogies from a Jewish first century point of view. Okay? All right, so now I want to do this little thing every week. I want to do a be a disciple moment. Okay, so being a disciple, we are supposed to be conformed to the image of our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, right? The Bible says so. We're supposed to spend our lives becoming more like him because he is the image of God. He is the seen image of the invisible God. Okay? Everything that he did and would do shows us what kind of God we have. And in Galatians 5:22 and 23, we see that Yeshua is loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, good, faithful, gentle, and self-controlled. I mean, with all the stuff that people do, And we're all still alive. We know that God is all those things. Hello, because he could have just like, if I was God, that's probably exactly what would happen. I better be dead a long time ago. Sorry, but I'm not a very patient person or kind or loving or I just get angry one day and snip my fingers and that'd be it. So anyway, what are simple things we can do? I want you to think about things you can do, little things, to make people's lives better, to start learning how to serve others. This is a real easy way, but I want you to get your parents' permission, okay? And I don't want you to do anything ever dangerous. I want you to always be with your parents when you would do these things. And I want your parent right beside you when you're doing these things, and I want you to have their permission. Okay, so the shopping cart experiment. All right, have you ever gone to the store with your mom and seen, well, especially this drives me crazy, when someone leaves a shopping cart in the middle of a handicap spot? That's just messed up. Or somebody doesn't return their cart and they leave it, and sometimes you get a lot of carts out there. Well, something I taught my kids to do once they were, tall enough and right beside me, is that when we see shopping carts in the parking lot, that we take them to the cart return, or sometimes we actually take them inside. Of course, there are times when this is dangerous, when it's really busy, okay? But the reason I do it is because about 25 years ago, when I was living in southern Idaho, I watched a family get into the car in the shopping in the thing beside across from me. They did not return their cart. They just parked it behind the car next to them. It was a very windy day. And while I was putting my groceries away, I turn around and all of a sudden I hear this crash. And this shopping cart has blown into my back light and it shattered it. It cost me $90 to fix. And this was back in the early 90s. This is, that was a lot of money for me. But I had to pay it, and I saw the people driving and they saw what happened and they never stopped. They also had a bumper sticker on the back of the car that said they were believers. Now, think about that. I want you to think in your everyday life, and we're going to go through examples every time, when we identify ourselves as believers and then we do something that damages someone else, or is as a bad witness, or makes people angry, or does, whatever, then we have caused them to think bad things about God. Okay? So being a disciple is about learning to represent God's character faithfully. And that is this week's suggestion, but remember, you do not do it without your mom's permission, or I'm going to come over there. No, I won't come over there, but I'd just be very disappointed. All right. Now, next week is going to be a PG-13 rated teaching. I do not want you to watch it without your parents' permission. Period. And it's going to be why Tamar is listed in Messiah's genealogy, and we're going to be talking about something called levirate marriage. It's a very sensitive subject, but it's important to know why it's a good thing that Tamar is in his genealogy, and why she is a woman of honor. So, even though to our modern eyes we kind of go, huh? But we're going to explain that. Anyway, that's it for this week. It was kind of a long lesson, but the genealogies are important to get right. And you know what? If you need to watch this a couple of times, that's fine. If you want to watch it once a year, or just when you have questions, please do. This is so important. There is nothing more important than learning about our Messiah. He died so that people like me, whose ancestors were pure pagan Gentiles way back when, he died so that people like me wouldn't be worshiping idols today. He's so wonderful. And, the whole Bible was written to point towards him. And everything he did in his life upheld the words of the Bible. He is wonderful, and his name is wonderful. Anyway, that's it for this week. I love you. I'm praying for you. And I hope you have a wonderful week studying the scriptures together as a family. Bye-bye now.